Imagine for a moment, you're walking the dark streets of Frankfurt, Germany. It's 1982. The neon lights of the Central Station District flash with vibrant colors. But there's something sinister in the air. Young men disappear without a trace, only to be found weeks later, in a way that will haunt investigators forever. This is the story of one of Europe's most disturbing serial killers, a ghostly predator who terrorized the Rhine region for 13 years, brutally and sadistically murdering 7 young women. A killer who remains in the shadows, free, perhaps still walking among us. Marcus, 17. Eric, also 17. Bernd, 18. Daniel, just 14. FET. And Oliver, a child of just 11. 7 lives taken by a monster that chose its victims in the dark. Knights of Frankfurt and Offenbach. What you're about to discover goes beyond a simple crime. This is a journey into the darkest depths of the human mind, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur completely. Before we dive into this disturbing investigation, if you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and crimes that defy all logic, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Today, we're going to explore a case that will keep you up at night, so get ready. Because truth is always scarier than fiction. The first body found in 1982 was so badly decomposed that it was nearly impossible to immediately identify. The contaminated water, the rats, the waste, everything had conspired to erase the identity of that young man who once had dreams, hopes, and a life ahead of him. But that was just the beginning. A few months later, another body, and then another. The sewage system of the Frankfurt metropolitan area was becoming the private graveyard of a killer who seemed to have found the perfect way to dispose of the evidence of his heinous crimes. Police began to realize they weren't dealing with isolated cases, but something far more sinister. A pattern was emerging from the murky waters. Young men, all violently killed, all discarded like garbage into the sewer system. It was as if a ghost were terrorizing the region, choosing its victims with surgical precision, and then vanishing them into the city's underground labyrinth. Commissioner Horstkoff, who led the investigation at the time, would later describe those initial findings as the most disturbing sight of my entire police career. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. To understand this killer, we must first understand where he operated. The Frankfurt Central Station District, especially the area around Baselplatz, was a very different place in the 1980s than it is today. It was a place where shadows stretched longer than they should, where red and blue neon lights created an almost cinematic atmosphere of danger and seduction. Baselplatz was known as a meeting place for the local LGBTQ+ community. At a time when homosexuality still carried a huge social stigma in Germany, this place offered a refuge, a space where young men could be themselves away from the judgmental gaze of conservative society. Nearby was the Tivoli, a gaming hall that also served as an informal meeting place. The establishment attracted not only gamblers, but also young people seeking company, conversation, and an escape from the often oppressive reality of their daily lives. It was the perfect setting for a predator, a place where vulnerable young people gathered, far from their families, far from witnesses who might later identify them. The killer had found his ideal hunting ground, a place where his victims came to him willingly. Investigations revealed that the victims were regularly seen in these areas at night. They knew each other, forming a small community of young people who shared similar experiences. Marcus knew Eric. Eric knew Bernd. Bernd knew Daniel. It was as if the killer was systematically eliminating an entire group of people, one by one. The killer's modus operandi was frighteningly efficient. He approached his victims at night, likely gaining their trust by offering something: companionship, drugs, money, or simply a listening ear. Young people, many of them dealing with family and social rejection, were easy targets for someone who knew exactly what to say. But what happened after he managed to lead his victims away from the busy streets was something that defied all normal human comprehension. The killer wasn't content with simply killing. He tortured, humiliated, and turned their final moments into a living hell. The choice of location to dispose of the bodies also revealed a cold, calculating mind. The sewage system wasn't just convenient, it was strategic. The bodies would be carried away by the currents, contaminated, and decomposed, making identification nearly impossible. It was as if the killer wanted not only to kill, but also to completely erase the existence of his victims. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not only the number of victims, but also the systematic brutality with which they were treated. Forensic evidence revealed details that haunt investigators to this day, decades after the crimes. Killer followed a specific ritual with his victims. First, he tied them up, always with their hands behind their backs, a position that left them completely vulnerable and defenseless. This wasn't a quick, impulsive death, it was a deliberate, planned, sadistic process. Investigations indicated that many of the victims were still alive when they were disposed of in the sewage system. Imagine the horror. Conscious young people, bound, being forced into the dark, fetid tunnels, knowing that these would be their last moments alive. Some drowned in the contaminated water, others from injuries inflicted before disposal. The bodies would remain floating in the sewage system for weeks, sometimes months, before eventually being transported to treatment plants. During this time, rats, decomposition, and the facility's own mechanical systems disfigured the remains. Almost beyond recognition, Commissioner Horstkopf described the difficulty of working with this evidence. The conditions in which we found the bodies were indescribable. The auger system at the treatment plant had mutilated them even further. We had great difficulty even identifying the victims, which was crucial to continuing our investigation. The brutality of the crimes suggested that the killer took pleasure, not only in killing, but in prolonging his victim's suffering. He was not a killer out of necessity or even momentary rage. He was someone who had found in torture and murder a source of deeply perverse satisfaction. The killer's choice of victims also revealed disturbing aspects of his personality. He clearly preferred young homosexual men, but he wasn't limited to adults. Oliver, just 11 years old, didn't fit the usual pattern of other victims. This suggests the killer was escalating, expanding his criteria, perhaps becoming bolder or more desperate to satisfy his sadistic impulses. Oliver's case is particularly shocking. A child who had run away from home, dreaming of adventure and freedom, ended up in the hands of a monster. There was nothing sexual or romantic that could have lured the boy into the fatal encounter. This suggests the killer had developed new seduction strategies, perhaps posing as an authority figure or offering help to a lost child. With bodies regularly turning up at sewage treatment plants, police forces from Darmstadt, Frankfurt, and Offenbach joined forces in an unprecedented operation. It was a race against time, not only to capture the killer, but to prevent more. Young people from falling victim to his sadistic thirst. The first major challenge of the investigation was identifying the victims. The bodies arrived at the treatment plants in an advanced state of decomposition, disfigured by the sewage system and the treatment equipment itself. The technical police photographed clothing, personal belongings, and any detail that could aid. Identification missing person files were tirelessly combed. Each missing person report was compared with findings at the treatment plants. It took 2.5 years to identify the first victim, and from then on, the macabre puzzle began to form. The investigation revealed that the victims frequented the same places, knew each other, and were part of the same marginalized community. This created both an advantage and a disadvantage for the investigators. On the one hand, they had a clear, pattern to work with. On the other, the closed nature of the LGBTQ+ community at the time, which was rightly suspicious of the police, made it difficult to obtain statements and information. The pressure on investigators was immense. The media began reporting on the findings, creating panic among the population. Families of young gay men lived in a constant state of alert. The local LGBTQ+ community practically went into hiding, with many avoiding traditional gathering places. But the killer seemed immune to the pressure. He continued to act, continued to choose his victims, continued to perform his macabre rituals. It was as if the intensified investigation only spurred him on even further. Amidst the desperate investigation, police finally found a solid lead. A 51-year-old man, a resident of the Riederwald neighborhood, caught the investigators' attention. He owned a community garden in the area, a secluded spot perfect for activities. Hidden from prying eyes, investigations revealed that this man had used his garden for sexual activities with young women, including sadistic practices involving physical and psychological torture. Several victims of these encounters decided to report him, leading to his criminal conviction. The profile seemed perfect. A man with a history of sexually assaulting young women, with access to a secluded location, operating in the same region, where the serial killer preyed on his victims. Investigators believed they had finally found their man. But there was a crucial problem. They couldn't find physical evidence directly linking him to the 7 murders. While the suspect fit the profile, and his activities in the garden demonstrated a sadistic tendency consistent with the crimes, there was no DNA, fingerprints, or any other forensic evidence that would support a murder charge. Commissioner Horskopf described the team's frustration. "The worst thing for us is when we know through the police investigation that we have a suspect, but we cannot legally prove his guilt for the crimes. Without sufficient evidence, there is no prosecution." The man was convicted only for the sexual assault crimes that could be proven through the testimony of his surviving victims. But the 7 murders remained officially unsolved. It was a partial victory that tasted like a complete defeat. This raises a disturbing question that haunts the case to this day. Was the real killer imprisoned for lesser crimes, serving a sentence that didn't reflect the true extent of his monstrosity? Or did the real killer remain free, perhaps continuing his crimes in other locations, other cities, other countries? The possibility that the killer simply moved and continued killing in other jurisdictions is something that keeps retired investigators awake at night. Serial killers rarely stop voluntarily. They are captured, die, or are forced to cease their activities by external circumstances. The fact that the murders apparently ceased after 1989 doesn't necessarily mean the killer stopped killing. It could simply mean that he became more careful about hiding the bodies, or that he moved to an area where his crimes weren't connected to the Rhineland murders. To try to understand the mind behind these heinous crimes, police consulted criminologist Rudolf Egg, one of Germany's leading experts in criminal psychology. His profile of the killer created a haunting picture of a deeply disturbed predator. According to Egg, the killer likely lived a solitary life, without close family or a significant social circle. He wasn't someone who drew attention. On the contrary, he likely went unnoticed in the crowd, a social ghost who had learned to blend in unnoticed. But there was something much darker in his psychology. Egg theorizes that the killer was likely a victim of childhood sexual abuse, creating a deeply conflicted relationship with his own sexuality. He wasn't simply a repressed homosexual, he was someone who had developed a love-hate relationship with same-sex sexual contact. It could be someone who can't openly accept their homosexuality, Egg explained. Someone who has absorbed this part of themselves in a completely distorted way, rejecting in themselves and others what they can't accept but also can't help. This psychological dynamic would create a terrifying vicious cycle. The killer would be attracted to young men, But this attraction would generate a self-destructive rage that he would project onto his victims. He wasn't just killing others. He was trying to kill a part of himself he hated but couldn't eradicate. The specific targeting of young homosexual men would therefore not be merely a predatory preference, but a deep psychological compulsion. Each victim would represent a version of himself that he despised, and each murder would be a futile attempt to resolve his own internal conflicts through extreme violence. The brutality of the methods, the torture, the sadism, the disposal of the bodies like garbage suggests someone who had completely dehumanized his victims. In the killer's twisted mind, they were not people, but symbols of everything he hated about himself. This dehumanization would also explain how he managed to continue killing for so long. There was no guilt or remorse, because in his distorted perception of reality, he wasn't killing human beings. He was eliminating representations of his own inner demons. Egg's profile also suggests that the killer likely led a well-constructed double life. During the day, he would be an ordinary person, perhaps even respected in his community. But at night, especially in his hunting grounds in Frankfurt and Offenbach, he transformed into a completely different predator. This duality is common in serial killers, but in the case of the Rhine Phantom, it seems to have been developed to an almost artistic level. He managed to operate for 13 years without arousing significant suspicion, indicating extraordinary control over his public persona. Among all the tragedies of this case, perhaps the greatest is how the victims were, in a sense, killed twice. First by the killer, then by social oblivion. Their names became mere statistics in police files, but each had a story, dreams, and people who loved them. Marcus, 17, was a young man searching for his place in the world. Like many teenagers of his generation, he struggled with questions of identity in a society that didn't offer much room for differences. The streets of Frankfurt offered a freedom that his hometown might not have. Eric, also 17, shared a friendship with Marcus. They met at community gathering places and discovered they were not alone in their struggles. This friendship, which should have been a source of strength and support, turned into a double tragedy when they both fell into the hands of the same predator. Bert, 18, had just reached the age of legal adulthood. It was a moment that should have represented new possibilities, greater freedom, the beginning of adulthood. Instead, it marked the premature end of a life that had barely begun to be lived fully. Daniel, 14, was just a child. His presence among the victims reveals how the killer was willing to expand his selection criteria. Daniel may not even have fully understood his own sexuality. He was just beginning to discover who he was when his journey was brutally cut short. Effie remains a mysterious figure with no biographical details preserved in the surviving records. This lack of information is, in itself, a tragedy, a life so completely erased that not even his personal history has survived. 11-year-old Oliver represents perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. A child who had run away from home, likely seeking adventure or escaping family problems. Instead of the freedom he sought, he found a predator who had no hesitation in torturing and killing a defenseless child. The seventh victim, whose name has never been discovered, symbolizes the most haunting aspect of the case. We don't know who she was, where she came from, or who may have mourned her absence. It's a disturbing reminder of how many people disappear without a trace, especially those living on the margins of society. These victims shared a common vulnerability. They were young people searching for acceptance and community in a society that rejected them. The killer exploited this vulnerability with calculated cruelty, turning the search for human connection into a death trap. It's important to remember that each of these deaths represents not only a life lost, but also a future canceled. How many contributions to society were lost? How many stories of love, friendship, creativity, and personal growth were cut short before they even began? The Rhine Phantom killer case left scars that extend far beyond the 7 lives lost. It fundamentally changed how German police approach serial crime investigations, forced changes in how society treats marginalized communities, and set a dark precedent for future predators. For the LGBTQ+ community in Frankfurt and the surrounding region, the murders created an atmosphere of terror that persisted long after. 1989. Young people seeking community and acceptance were forced to choose between isolation and the risk of death. Many chose isolation, preferring solitude to the possibility of becoming the next victim. The traditional meeting places, Basler Platz, Tivoli, were never the same again. What were once spaces of freedom and expression became places haunted by memories of terror. The community lost not only 7 of its members, but also its sacred spaces of gathering and mutual support. For the investigators, the case represented both a professional failure and a personal trauma. Commissioner Horstgoff, even decades after his retirement, still speaks about the case with a mixture of frustration and obsession. This case left a deep impression on me and my colleagues, he admits. It was so unusual, so brutal. The brutality of the crimes also forced investigators to confront aspects of human nature they would otherwise prefer to ignore, repeatedly seeing the results of extreme human cruelty leaves lasting psychological scars. Many of the officers involved in the case required psychological support to deal with the images and evidence they encountered. The case also exposed shortcomings in the criminal justice system at the time. The difficulty in identifying the victims, the lack of preserved forensic evidence, and the difficulty in obtaining cooperation from a marginalized community. All of these factors contributed to the killer never being officially brought to justice. These lessons were incorporated into later police protocols. Today's serial crime investigations follow much more rigorous procedures for preserving evidence, identifying victims, and constructing psychological profiles. The legacy of the Rhine Ghost can be seen in every modern criminal investigation manual, but perhaps the most disturbing legacy is the possibility that the killer never completely stopped. Serial killers rarely retire voluntarily. They are captured, die, or are forced to cease their activities by external circumstances. What happened to the Rhine Ghost remains a mystery that haunts investigators to this day. Decades after the last confirmed murder, numerous theories have emerged to explain the sudden disappearance of the Rhine Phantom killer. Each theory carries its own disturbing implications about the predator's fate and the true scope of his crimes. First, and perhaps most optimistic, theory is that the killer died of natural causes or accidents between 1989 and the present day. This would explain why the murders abruptly ceased and why no evidence of similar crimes has ever been found in the area. However, considering that the killer was likely between 30 and 50 years old at the time of the crimes, he could still be alive today. The second theory is even darker. The killer simply moved to another region, state, or country, continuing his crimes in different jurisdictions where they were not connected to the original murders. This possibility is particularly chilling because it suggests that there may be dozens of other victims scattered across Europe, all killed by the same predator, but never connected due to a lack of communication between different police forces. A third theory proposes that the killer was arrested for other crimes, perhaps assault, domestic violence, or minor sexual offenses, and served a prison sentence that coincided with the cessation of the murders. In this scenario, he could have been released in recent years and is currently living a seemingly normal life somewhere in Germany or Europe. The fourth theory, and perhaps the most disturbing, is that the killer simply became more cautious. Instead of disposing of bodies in the sewer system where they would eventually be discovered, he may have developed more effective disposal methods that ensure the victims are never found. In this scenario, he could have continued killing to this day, with his victims classified as missing persons rather than homicide victims. There's also the possibility that increased police surveillance and media coverage forced the killer to completely change his modus operandi. He may have abandoned young gay men as his primary target and moved on to other victims, the homeless, prostitutes, drug addicts, groups less likely to have their deaths intensively investigated. A particularly shocking theory suggests that the killer may have developed connections with organized crime networks, using his sadistic impulses to serve organizations that need to eliminate people discreetly. In this scenario, he would have turned his homicidal compulsion into a professional career, continuing to kill, but now with purposes beyond personal satisfaction. There is also speculation that the killer may have become more technologically sophisticated, using the internet and social media to find victims. Digital platforms offer new ways to identify vulnerable young people, gaining their trust online before meeting them in person. This evolution would be a natural adaptation for a predator who has survived decades without being caught. The most haunting theory of all is that the Rhine ghost was never an isolated individual, but part of a larger network of predators operating in a coordinated manner. In this scenario, what appeared to be a lone serial killer was actually a member of an organized group that specialized in eliminating marginalized youth. When one member of the network was discovered or became too visible, others took over their activities. Each of these theories has different implications for current public safety. If the killer is dead, the threat has ceased. If he has moved or changed his methods, there may be other victims who have not yet been discovered or connected to the original crimes. If he is part of a larger network, the problem may be much more widespread than anyone imagined. The Phantom Killer of the Rhine case became a fundamental case study in German and European police academies. Its lessons shaped investigative protocols that are still used today in serial crime cases across Europe. The first major lesson was the importance of rapid victim identification. The 2.5-year delay in identifying the first victim was deemed unacceptable, leading to the development of more efficient missing persons databases and improvements in forensic identification techniques. The case also highlighted the need for better communication between different police jurisdictions. The fact that the killer operated in multiple cities, Frankfurt, Offenbach, and other areas in the region, initially made it difficult to identify a single predator. Today, computerized systems allow different police departments to share information. Instantly. The preservation of physical evidence has also been revolutionized. Bodies found in treatment plants were in such degraded conditions that crucial evidence, DNA, fingerprints, fibers from the killer's clothing, was lost forever. Modern protocols require that crime scenes be processed with much greater care, even when the evidence appears compromised. The psychological aspect of investigation has also evolved significantly. The profile created by Rudolf Egg was one of the first examples of systematic criminal profiling in Germany. Today, forensic psychologists are routinely consulted in serial crime cases, and their profiles are much more sophisticated and accurate. The relationship between police and marginalized communities has also changed dramatically. The initial difficulty in obtaining cooperation from Frankfurt's LGBTQ+ community led to the development of specific protocols for working with groups that have historically distrusted law enforcement. Surveillance techniques have also evolved in response to the Rhine ghost's methods. His ability to operate undetected in the same hunting grounds for years has forced police to develop more sophisticated methods of monitoring areas where serial crimes may be occurring. The use of media and public communication in serial crime investigations has also been reshaped. Coverage of the Reno murders demonstrated both the benefits public awareness, potential witness leads, and the risks public panic, interference in investigations of media exposure. DNA databases, which didn't exist at the time of the murders, now allow evidence to be preserved indefinitely. If the Rhine ghost were captured today, his DNA could be compared with evidence from unsolved crimes across Europe, potentially revealing the true scope of his activities. Behavioral pattern analysis techniques also benefited from the case's lessons. The killer's choice of victims, the locations where he found them, and his methods of disposing of bodies created a template that is used today to identify other serial killers who may be operating in a similar fashion. Psychological training for investigators has also been improved. The evident trauma suffered by officers working on the case led to the development of psychological support programs for officers dealing with particularly brutal crimes. One of the most disturbing questions about the case is whether the phantom killer of the Rhine may be connected to other unsolved crimes in Europe. In the decades since the last confirmed murders, investigators have identified several cases that share troubling similarities. In Amsterdam, during the 1990s, a series of young men disappeared in a similar fashion, frequenting gay bars before vanishing completely. Their bodies were never found, but the pattern of disappearances disturbingly mirrors the Rhine ghost's hunting methods. In Brussels, investigators discovered evidence that someone was using the sewage system to dispose of bodies during the mid-1990s. Although only fragments were recovered, the disposal techniques were remarkably similar to those used in the Rhine region. More recently, in 2010, authorities in Hamburg found human remains in a sewage treatment plant. The victim was a 19-year-old who had disappeared after frequenting local gay community gathering places. The disposal method and the condition of the body were eerily reminiscent of the Frankfurt and Offenbach crimes. Eurojust, the European Union's agency for judicial cooperation, now maintains a database specifically dedicated to crimes that may be connected across national borders. The Rhine ghost case served as one of the founding examples of this initiative. Creation of pan-European DNA profiles was also partly motivated by cases like this. If genetic evidence had been preserved from the original crimes, it could now be compared with unsolved crimes across Europe, potentially revealing connections that had remained hidden for decades. But perhaps the most disturbing connection is to crimes that may be occurring right now. If the Rhine ghost is still alive and kicking, he would now be between 60 and 80 years old, an age when many serial killers become more cautious, but don't necessarily stop killing. After decades of investigation, analysis, and speculation, the Rhine Phantom killer case remains fraught with fundamental questions that may never be answered. These questions are not merely academic. They have direct implications for public safety and our understanding of the nature of human evil. The first and most obvious question is, who was the killer? Despite all the resources invested in the investigation, decades of police work, and significant technological advances, their identity remains completely unknown. They could be anyone, a neighbor, a seemingly harmless retiree, or even someone you know personally. The second crucial question is, how many victims did he actually claim? The 7 bodies found at the treatment plants may represent only a fraction of his criminal activities. How many other young people disappeared without a trace? How many bodies were disposed of in ways that ensured they would never be discovered? A third haunting question is, why did he stop? Serial killers rarely cease their activities voluntarily. What happened in 1989 that forced the Rhine Phantom to halt his murderous spree? Was it death, imprisonment, illness, or simply a change of strategy? The fourth disturbing question is, did he act alone? The efficiency with which he operated, his ability to lure unsuspecting victims, and the precision with which he disposed of bodies suggest a level of organization that may have required assistance. Is it possible he had accomplices who have never been identified? A fifth fundamental question is, what role did contemporary society play in allowing these crimes to continue? Did the marginalization of the LGBTQ+ community create an environment where vulnerable young people became easy targets? Did police reluctance to aggressively investigate crimes against sexual minorities contribute to the killer's impunity? The sixth question, perhaps the most disturbing, is, did he influence other criminals? Could the Rhine ghost's modus operandi using the sewer system to dispose of bodies have inspired other killers? Is there evidence that later criminals copied his methods? A seventh important technical question is, what evidence still exists? Decades later, what physical materials from the original crimes are still preserved in police vaults? With advances in forensic technology, especially DNA analysis, could this old evidence reveal new clues if re-examined? The eighth strategic question is, how can we prevent similar crimes in the future? What specific lessons from the Rhine Phantom case can be applied to identify and capture serial killers who may be operating in a similar manner today? A ninth, complex ethical question is, what is the ongoing impact of these unsolved crimes on the victims' families? Decades without answers, without justice, without closure. How does this affect the loved ones of the murdered young people? The 10th, and perhaps most important question is there any way to still solve this case? With new advances in technology, behavioral analysis, and international cooperation, is there any realistic hope that the Rhine ghost can finally be identified and brought to justice? These questions are not merely intellectual. Each represents unresolved aspects of a real human tragedy that affected dozens of lives, the victims, their families, the investigators, and the broader community that lived under the shadow of these crimes for years. And so we come to the end of this disturbing investigation into one of the most haunting cases in European criminology. The Phantom Killer of the Rhine remains at large, his identity unknown, his motives a mystery, and his current location an enigma that could pose a continuing danger to society. Marcus, Eric, Bernd, Daniel, FET, Oliver, and the unnamed seventh victim deserve justice. Their families deserve answers. Society deserves protection from predators who may still be operating in the shadows. If you have any information about these crimes, no matter how insignificant it may seem, please contact the authorities. Murder never expires, not in Germany, not anywhere. There is still time for justice to be served. If this case fascinated you as much as it did me, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more investigations into unsolved crimes that continue to haunt our societies. Hit the notification bell because we have many more disturbing mysteries to explore together. Share this video with people who might be interested in criminology, unsolved mysteries, or simply stories that challenge our understanding of human nature. The more people know about this case, the greater the chance that someone, somewhere, may have the information that will finally solve this decades-old mystery. In the comments, tell me, do you believe the Rhine ghost is still alive? Which theory about his disappearance makes the most sense to you? Do you know of any similar cases that might be connected? And remember, the truth is out there, waiting to be discovered. Sometimes it's hidden in dusty police files. Sometimes it's in the memory of someone who hasn't yet realized the importance of what they know. And sometimes it's walking among us, disguised as an ordinary person, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Until the next investigation, stay safe, trust your instincts, and remember, real monsters don't hide under the bed. They hide in plain sight, waiting for their next opportunity. This was another dive into the depths of unsolved paranormal crimes. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey, and we'll see you in the next mystery.